Today is Monday, July 6th, 2026, and today is National Fried Chicken Day, which means somewhere, someone is about to insist they know the one place that has the best fried chicken, and they're probably willing to argue about it. And after digging through today's stories, I noticed they all had something in common: a king, a bank robber, and a Beatles song. None of them became legendary the moment they appeared. Their reputations grew. Their stories spread, and over time, they became larger than life. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and your guide through the tiny historical details that somehow make humanity look even stranger. On July 6, 1189, Richard I became the King of England. Although, if you had asked the average English citizen where their new king actually was, the answer was often, not here. History remembers him as Richard the Lionheart, the fearless warrior king, the heroic crusader, the very picture of medieval courage. It's an incredible reputation. What's surprising is how little time he actually spent ruling England in person. Richard became king at the age of 31. During his 10-year reign, historians estimate he spent about 6 months in England. The rest of the time, he was fighting. First during the Third Crusade, then as a prisoner in Germany after being captured on his journey home, and finally defending his French territories. To Richard, England wasn't really home. It was the kingdom that financed his military campaigns. He even reportedly joked that he would have sold London itself if he could have found a buyer. Not exactly the kind of quote you'd expect from one of England's most celebrated kings. And yet, centuries later, Richard is remembered as the ideal knight. Brave, honorable, fearless in battle. His reputation became larger than his actual reign. It reminds me that history doesn't always remember people for where they spent their time. Sometimes it remembers the stories people tell about them afterward. And of course, not every legendary story begins with a crown. Some begin with an explosion. On July 6, 1907, one of the boldest bank robberies in history took place in Tiflis, in what is now Tbilisi, Georgia. The country, not the state. The target was a horse-drawn stagecoach carrying money through a crowded city square. The thieves didn't quietly sneak in. They attacked in broad daylight. Bombs exploded. Gunfire erupted. Chaos spread through the streets. When it was over, they had escaped with roughly 340,000 rubles. Adjusted for today, that's worth several $1 million. It's an astonishing crime story all by itself. But here's the part that makes historians stop. One of the men behind the robbery was a young revolutionary, whose real name was Joseph Stalin. The world would eventually know him by another name, Joseph Stalin. Decades before he became the leader of the Soviet Union, before he controlled one of the largest countries on earth, before he became one of the 20th century's most controversial and consequential figures, he was helping organize what amounted to an armed robbery. The money wasn't meant for personal wealth. It was intended to finance revolutionary activities. Still, it remains one of the most dramatic examples of political fundraising in history. It's one of those stories that completely changes the picture many people have in their heads. History has a way of freezing famous people at the height of their power. But before they became the names we recognize, they often lived lives that were far more stranger than we imagine. But fortunately, our final story is about a much happier way to become unforgettable. Sometimes, all it takes is the right song. On July 6, 1967, the Beatles recorded All You Need Is Love. Now, if that title sounds familiar, it's because the song wasn't written for an ordinary album. It was written for something the world had never seen before. A live international television broadcast called Our World. Today, the idea of a worldwide live event doesn't seem all that remarkable. We stream sporting events, concerts, rocket launches. Even someone unboxing a phone can attract millions of viewers. But in 1967, this was revolutionary. Using satellite technology, the program connected 24 countries and was watched by an estimated 400 million people. For the very first time in history, people around the globe were sharing the same live television experience. The United Kingdom had to decide what it wanted to show the world. Its answer? The Beatles. John Lennon wrote All You Need Is Love specifically for the occasion. He intentionally kept the message simple. After all, if your audience speaks dozens of different languages, you probably don't want complicated lyrics. The performance became one of the defining cultural moments of the 1960s. Musicians, artists, and friends filled the studio. The atmosphere felt spontaneous, joyful, and wonderfully chaotic. Even today, more than a half a century later, people instantly recognize those opening notes. I've always liked the symbolism of that moment. The first truly global television broadcast didn't lead with politics, or military power, or technology. It led with music. And looking back across today's stories, I'd realized every one of them involved a reputation that grew larger over time. A king became a legend. A robbery became a historical curiosity because of who was involved. And a song became an anthem for an entire generation. That brings us to someone who understands a thing or two about building a legendary reputation. Born on July 6, 1946, Sylvester Stallone has spent decades playing characters who refuse to quit. The funny thing is, before he ever became Rocky Balboa, he had to live like Rocky. In the mid-1970s, Stallone was struggling. Really struggling. He was broke. He was living in a tiny apartment. He'd been turned down for role after role. Then he watched a boxing match between Muhammad Ali and Chuck Wepner. Wepner wasn't expected to last long against the heavyweight champion. Instead, he knocked Ali down and went the distance before finally losing. The fight stuck with Stallone. Over the next few days, he wrote the screenplay for Rocky. Studios loved it. There was just one problem. They didn't want Stallone. They wanted an established movie star, someone with box office appeal. They were willing to pay good money for the script, as long as someone else played Rocky. Stallone refused. He believed that if he'd written the story, he needed to be the one to tell it. Eventually, the studio agreed, but only after he accepted a much smaller payday. It was an enormous gamble, one that changed his life forever. Rocky won the Academy Award for Best Picture. The character became an icon, and Stallone built one of the most successful careers in Hollywood history. I've always admired that story because it reminds me that persistence isn't always loud. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let someone else tell your story. And looking back across today's stories, I kept thinking about how legends are made. Richard the Lionheart became larger than the kingdom he ruled. A daring robbery became famous because of the man history would later know as Joseph Stalin. The Beatles performed a song that became a symbol of hope for millions of people around the world. And Sylvester Stallone bet on himself when almost no one else was willing to. None of them knew how history would remember them. They simply lived their moment. The legend came later. Anyway, that's what stood out to me while digging through July 6th. I think Muhammad Ali captured that idea better than I ever could. Impossible is just a big word thrown around by small men. If you'd like to hear more of my work, audiobooks, or other projects I've somehow gotten myself involved in, you can find everything over at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and honestly, thank you for spending a little time being curious with me. I'll see you tomorrow.